My guest today is Nick Hart. Nick is a British singer, multi-instrumentalist and ethnomusicologist. He has a huge knowledge of folk songs and the traditions and has mainly focused on recording English folk songs. We have a wide-ranging chat about these and other topics, and I hope you'll enjoy this interview. Welcome, Nick.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thanks. Yeah, we're sort of at, a stage now where things have been kind of opening up a bit since the lockdown began. So yeah, I'm finding it easier. I went like properly mad at the beginning of lockdown because I am, by nature a show off, and if there isn't anyone around to be able to show off to, then it's a bit tricky. But yeah, I'm all right now. It's nice sort of being able to see people again and leave the house a bit more.
Oh, that's good. So did you sort of have a lot of gigs lined up or anything that you had to cancel? Or?
Yeah. So I had a tour, a sort of April-May tour, which was obviously all cancelled. All the summer festivals cancelled, and now obviously the autumn tour, which was sort of meant to be October, November time. Is that a lot of those gigs are starting to be cancelled as well now, which is sort of not surprising, but a bit worrying.
Yeah,
it must be said. But I've been relatively lucky in that I managed to get a bit of money off the Arts Council, one of their emergency funding grants, which helped, and I got a bit of money off the government for, because I've been self-employed for long enough to have been able to get that.
Right.
But yeah, it's it's scary, and we don't know exactly what form things are going to take when they come back to life again. Really, there will be. I think there probably will be some positives to come out of this in some ways, in terms of particularly for folk music, in terms of things will have to be done differently, and I think there's actually, I think a lot of the performance contexts in which folk music has been played over the don't necessarily seem relevant to a younger generation of potential listeners, if that makes sense. And I think a lot of it can be quite off-putting for young people. So I think the fact that the industry is going to have to find new ways to do things, it might end up being that we remake it in an image that's I don't know, feels a bit more inclusive or feels a bit more progressive in some ways. I think. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of interested in what you mean by sort of presentations. Do you mean sort of the kind of folk club circuit or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of the I think because I think what's so wonderful about the sense of continuity in a lot of the folk festivals, which have been going for years and years and years, and are brilliant and do a wonderful job, and likewise a lot of folk clubs have been going for ages and are wonderful. But I feel, even as I've talked about this before, but I feel that even as a performer going into a lot of those spaces, there is an awful lot of there is a sort of proprietorial feel that you get from a lot of the punters. There are people who've been going to these festivals for 40 years or to that club and it's a wonderful thing, that continuity of that someone's been there. But actually, somewhat I think it's easy to turn up to one of those places as a performer or as an audience member and sometimes feel like it's not, like you're an incomer, like you're invading someone's space, this thing that belongs to this group of people. And I think actually, I know I've had conversations with people who, particularly here in Bristol, where there is a, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, there seems to have been this real huge flourishing of a very lovely grassroots scene with lots of young people involved in it, in lots of stuff, lots of very community-minded stuff, sing around and sessions and things like that. as well as nice little gigs that are going on, all over the city. That's speaking to a lot of people there who, they've been so happy to come to that this stuff has been going on and has been done in that way, because I've people have spoken to me about that feeling of slight unease or being made to feel slightly not unwelcome, but just like they're an incomer in lots of other contexts. So I think finding a way to it may or may not be that the way that we the industry will have to behave differently. I think after all this we're not going to just go back to exactly how it was, and certainly not quickly. Sure. So finding ways to do that, taking advantage of the fact that we have to do things differently, I think is a very important thing, and being mindful of what changes could be made in order to bring more people in, and for it to be something that more people have access to.
I've talked to a few people, for instance John Wilkes as well, sort of said something like that he's always felt on the fringes of the folk thing, but I think you're much more deeply sort of ingrained in that tradition, I would say, or is that not the case?
I think so. I've certainly been around it for a long time, and I've been actively involved with it in various capacities for longer than John has. But I still feel, I've come at things a very different way. There's a lot of, I'm 30 now, and right. I kind of, a lot of my contemporaries, a lot of musicians who are my own age, but have been actually performing on the big stages and festivals for far longer. That I never made use of any of those, these kind of schemes to get young musicians up on stages, and the whole folk works thing. Like a lot of them sort of benefited from, not because it wasn't, but just because I wasn't sort of. I didn't end up going through any of those kind of things. So in some respects, I've not, loads of, I'd say still quite a lot of people in the folk world that have no idea who I am. Well, that's certainly my perspective on it. For better or worse. So, I still feel like really in terms of gigging and getting festival gigs, there's still. I still feel like I'm very much on the back foot with all that, but I have been around it for a long time.
I find that kind of extraordinary in a way, because I was talking a bit to Jim Murray about you actually, saying that I would hope to be able to get a conversation with you. But one of the things that I was saying is that, and actually Jim put it very well. He basically said that even though what you do is very traditional, it's a modern person doing it, and I would have thought from many or most people interested in traditional folk music that what you do is traditional enough that they would find that that's absolutely it sits well with them.
It's an interesting thing, and it is an interesting thing about the different reactions that I've got in front of different types of audiences, because obviously all I can go on is I am literally the last person on earth who can give an opinion of my own worth or value as a traditional musician. But what is interesting is I think the folk scene, the sort of established folk scene, the sort of folk festival, folk club sort of circuit, that world and that audience seems to be much less interested in me than the kind of an engaged arts audience who may want a bit of folk music every now and then. If you know what I mean. I think the sort of mainstream folk scene has been, rightly or wrongly, sort of obsessed with the idea of novelty. That's been a big thing for a long time. So people. Someone like Jim did very well at the beginning of his career. Because it was, great, another new young person who's doing something in a different way. And obviously there was this nominal controversy which around his music of, oh, is he doing it right? Is it bad that he should be using, drum loops or whatever thing, But actually, I think generally speaking, that's sort of the norm now. The norm in a lot of the folk scene is that you have to be making some kind of bold innovation or you know what I mean? And I'm not necessarily, but there's been a lot of that over the years. I think there is something about, there is something almost, I don't know. Yeah, I think someone very quiet, fairly quietly, just plugging away at getting good at singing ballads is not. And there's also not as exciting a narrative there, is there?
It's fascinating thing, really, because in a way, and I think one of the things that my conversation with Jim was that the idea of traditional music has almost exploded and doesn't really exist as a thing anymore, because everybody is doing a different, new type of thing, and yet there are still musicians and artists like yourself who are really focused on the style of folk that kind of became very popular in the 60s folk revival type of era. So you weren't just floor singing, but it was singing with guitars or those kind of things, and sparse arrangements, which I absolutely love. But I find that absolutely mad that that it's that's almost a point of a negative point against you, that people find that they can't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, they've maybe a lot of a folk audience in their 60s and 70s, which makes up a lot of people. Maybe they just feel like they've seen it all before, and that's like fair enough, because they probably have. But I mean, it's interesting. The tradition, like as you say, there's what is designed. I mean, really, if you want to talk about the English song tradition, then if you're doing it in any way other than it being unaccompanied, then you're already doing it. You're already making an innovation in some respect.
Yeah, that's
right. So finding a way of doing it, essentially my approach to accompaniment, certainly on the first two albums, they had two albums that are out.
Yeah.
And for most of my gigs as a solo performer, it's essentially the same approach that Martin Carthy takes really to his guitar playing, as far as I can tell. Not with quite the same dexterity or innovation that Martin does, but that it's a belongs to that same school. But actually, so I'm just coming to the end of, I'm just finishing mixing a new album, and that's actually very, very different.
Okay.
In that there are a lot more instruments in it.
Okay.
But still at the heart of it is a similar approach into a lot of the songs. So I'm using a lot of harmonium on this. I've got it's actually a reed organ. I've got a beautiful old sort of 1910s reed organ. And actually, it's, essentially what Martin Carthy, what I like about Martin Carthy's guitar style, and what a lot of my guitar style draws on, is this. It's something that, whilst not strictly heterophonic, it starts from heterophony. So heterophony is when you have two or more things which are all playing a variation of the same thing, if you know what I mean. So that the way I play the guitar often I'm playing. I'll be adding in bass notes as well, but the core of the guitar accompaniment is a version of the melody.
It follows the melody.
So, So doing that in other instruments. I've been playing a lot of viola da gamba, playing a lot of harmonium, various other bits of bobs. I've got a lyre and stuff like that I've been using a lot. And actually, realizing that there's doing it on lots of different instruments has made me realize, God, there is just still so much to explore in terms of heterophony as a style of accompaniment. And you look at traditional music from all over the world, and most singing, most sort of the more kind of direct singing tradition. So lots of Central Asian kind of traditions where it will be one singer accompanying himself with an instrument, or all across North Africa, lots of parts of East Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea. There'll be often, it's an instrument that's being accompanying a singer accompanying themselves and doing it well, or even like Qawwali music from Pakistan, which is a devotional music, but again, the harmonium is always,
it's playing the melody,
it's playing the melody, and that, realizing how huge a thing that is, how obvious that is as a kind of human instinct of how and to do that in a way that serves. I think it particularly lends itself to musics where the music isn't necessarily the most important thing, where there is a storytelling element or where there is a poet. You know what I mean? And I think that for me, I think that's just something that I'm going to keep exploring again and again and again in various forms.
It was something I was going to ask you about, actually, because clearly you're a multi-instrumentalist, very talented on different things. You've played melodeon and harmonium and concertina and fiddle and whatever. But I was going to ask you about the two albums that you've released. They're very stripped down, and they're very what I would say bare in one sense. But what I find fascinating is that it's almost like you've sculpted the essential things out of what could be a very big and wide and bold arrangement. And I've nothing against the big, the big things with lots of members and playing lots of different instruments and all of that kind of thing behind a ballad. But it seems like you very deliberately took the choice to go to that sparse place, but still really make it something amazing. It doesn't lack because you've taken out lots of notes.
Well, I mean, I think there is something about attention to detail as both a performer and as a listener. You know what I mean? In that there is as much. You can probably find enough to be excited about. In a well thought through performance of one person playing one instrument or singing with one instrument as you can with, we can only focus on so much at any one point, I think. And actually if you're not going to be able to zoom in on the finer details of some things a lot of the time, if there's loads of instruments going on. It's not to say that people don't do that brilliantly and that there isn't, instances where there is huge layers of detail excuse me, sort of inserted into bigger arrangements, but for me, it's certainly in terms of my attention span and my attention to detail, I found plenty to think about, even with doing it with 2 or 3 instruments and a voice, and that's I guess that's it. There's a lot of the music that I really like to listen to is small ensemble, very small ensemble stuff. So music from like I listen to a lot of Magam music from Azerbaijan, and that's generally a singer and a tar player and a kamancha player, and that the interplay between the voice and those two instruments is it just seems infinite what they can do with that, and so for me, I guess I've always been attracted to the smaller interplay between smaller forces.
So is that something you say you've done a new album and you've played more instruments and you've changed it? I'm going to guess it's called 10 English folk songs.
So I mean, it's not. It's. I mean, I can. Yes, you don't need to show you're working on that one. It's basically there are 10 tracks on this album, so I've left myself the option.
So where are you going to go from there?
I mean, part of me thinks it's a very different sounding album to the first two. The first two are kind of, they match. I think there's a sort of through line between those two in terms of it being the same instrumentation. Whereas this is bigger, and there are some tracks. There are lots of tracks where it's just me and an instrument. Lots of tracks where it's me and a couple of instruments, and then some where there's there's 2 or 3 tracks where there's a lot of stuff on there and lots of other voices as well, other human voices, particularly on one track. So it's going to feel. I think it feels like quite a different album, and I sort of wonder whether it should have a different title rather than. But also, like, my least favourite thing in the world is making up names for things. Right. So I may just fall back on 10 English folk songs just for lack of a better option. But, yeah, we'll see.
So are they again traditional songs, or?
Yeah, they are. So actually, when we were going into lockdown, I was sort of in the middle of. I basically decided to produce an album of. Well, write a load of settings of William Blake. Well, we tend to call them William Blake poems, but they are songs. William Blake wrote them as songs. So I was writing loads of settings of them, and I was basically going to make an album of that. and then lockdown sort of happened, and I was like, well, I've lost all my income. I was like, actually, without wishing to be too cynical about it, it would be really great if in like sort of, August, September, I had like an album that I knew a certain number of people would buy, and that I could just get a lump of money, which I think this should be slightly easier to get people to buy off me than something a bit more left field like that, without wishing to sound too cynical. But there was one actually that there was one of those Blake settings that I actually did record and recorded. It's a wonderful song called The Birds, and it's a conversation between 2 birds. It's really sweet, charming little. It's not that kind of slightly mad, not nowhere near as mad and psychedelic as the rest of his writing. Yeah. Which I did recorded as a duet with my dear friend Mo Kirby. But actually, so I was thinking about putting that on the album, and in the end, it just didn't sit right. So yes. That's a very roundabout way of saying yes. It's all traditional songs again.
So how do you go about picking them? And obviously you've built a repertoire of a lot of songs, and clearly there are thousands of songs out there. But how do you pick the ones that really have merit, that you feel like, first of all, have a resonance for you and a connection for you, but then also you feel like are going to become part of a cohesive album? Because it's far more than just picking some songs and sticking them together and hoping that it works. I think you actually really kind of theme things and put a lot of thought into how you put that together, from what I can hear at least. Yeah.
So I think with certainly with this album, I'm trying to look at. I've actually got them all written on the wall. What songs they were. They're a real mix in that some of them are, there are a few that have been in my repertoire for, 10 years. When I was about 20, was when I really got obsessed with English traditional songs. 19, 20, and I suddenly sort of, was just gorging on, field recordings of Old Boy. So that's still, where the sort of nucleus of my repertoire was acquired within that sort of 6-month period when I was just like absolutely obsessed. So a couple have been there. A couple I tried to record on previous albums and they didn't really work, and I find other ways of doing them, and or I'm just a bit better and can do them justice now. But then others are, there's still loads of traditional singers who were recorded, in the middle of the 20th century who I still haven't really listened to. So I was listening to lots of the kind of lots of recordings of the Willett family and May Bradley and Queen Caroline Hughes. All these are all gypsy singers, it must be said. Mm-hmm. And so listening to a lot of those during this and seeing what, if there was anything that caught my ear, or but again also, a lot of the time what I'll do is I'll think because I'm basically a smart ass. I very rarely like doing the version of a song that everyone else does. I try to always try to get a more obscure version. So there'll be often instances of thinking, oh, it would be lovely to have a version of that song in my repertoire, but I'll then go and look on the Vaughan Williams Memorial Library website and use the Raud Index search for a version, search through a load of different versions and see what works. And excuse me, my throat's very dry. Often end up stitching together the words of one and the tune of another, or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to ask if if it's a case of kind of putting together the bits that you like and kind of how you feel about that. One thing that when I interviewed Nancy Kerr, she said, it's like, I think it's a big difference that I'm a singer and not an archivist. So she feels very comfortable about about just pulling source material together and making her song from it. And is that kind of how you approach it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you can't. That's the thing, is it's all there. If I've got access to it, then someone in the future will have access to it. So I don't think we need to be preserving anything in aspic, and I'm always very keen to. I'd like to think I'm always diligent in my liner notes and in crediting where things come from. But I think ultimately it's about. It comes down. More and more. The more I do it, the more time I spend with this sort of this kind of music, this tradition is. It's all about the storytelling, really. Yeah. And finding a way to do that. That's keeping that in mind is it gives you the answer to, like, acknowledging, having that as a maxim gives you the answer to so many questions. So in finding your approach to finding material, or an approach to developing an accompaniment, or an approach to how you engage with an audience, if that is what's in your head all the time, it's as in, does it tell the story? Then that ends up showing, you very quickly realise what the answer to all those questions is. You know what I mean? So sometimes there are lovely songs. Sometimes there's something very charming or beautiful about, a song where there are a version of a song where there are, loads of verses missing, or there are a very pared down version of the story. And sometimes that's perfect and charming and very succinct, and you think, well, I'll just leave that as it is. And there are other instances where you think, well, actually, there's a lot missing here, and whilst it's easy for me, who knows this song, I've heard 20 versions of this song, so I know what the story is, but actually the audience don't necessarily. So you might want to put things in, or so there's an old Robin Hood ballad that I'm doing here, which was recorded in the in the 20th century. I mean it's actually, doing some research, it's very obviously come from an early 19th century printed version, which would have been a kind of someone would have essentially rewritten a much older ballad. Okay. And it's meant to sound very ye old Englandy, but was recorded by, I think, one of the Willett brothers, Tom Willett or Charlie Willett. Anyway, Gloucestershire gypsy family, I think. And his version is amazing. This amazing melody. You get a rough shape of the story, but there are lots of verses missing. So I've recorded that on the album, and I've reinserted lots of the verses from the thing. And obviously this is a difficult thing to match it up sometimes, because his version is like beautifully vernacular and had a lot of the edges knocked off, and the verses that I'm getting out of, like, the child ballads are very, the sentences, each sentence is absolutely full of words and very kind of Victorian, the Victorian more is more approach to everything. And so trying to marry them up is difficult, and what you don't want to, it's that difficult. It's like when you're doing, English heritage. Is it English heritage? You're in charge of these sorts of things, like writing they're in terms of like doing listed buildings.
Yeah,
Aren't they, in this
yeah,
country.
that's right.
And in terms of government guidelines, for years, for the last sort of 20 or something years, the adage, that if you want to get an extension on your listed building, it has to be very visibly from a different period too. They would prefer it be visibly modern, so as not to make the contrast clear.
Right.
And you sort of think in terms of in this approach, you think what I don't want to be doing is trying to. Do I want to be trying to smudge the edges so it's seamlessly, so it works seamlessly, or do I want to be able to show the repairs? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one. It must be said.
I think it just comes down to what you want to do as an artist, because I think at a certain point, yes, there is a long line of people standing behind you who've sung that song before, back into whenever it was first, put together. But I think, as well as I do, that every one of those singers will have made it their own in some way, and they'd have made choices about words, and they'd have made choices about melody, and those things kind of evolve and develop, particularly when it's kind of oral tradition of how it's passed on. So I think in some senses it doesn't really matter. I'm very much a fan of trying to use more modern vernacular, partly because I can't really think in Old English or Middle English or even Victorian English. That said, when I've tried, or I haven't tried, but sometimes it's just happened that I've written in a way that feels fairly archaic, but then I might update it in the final version just because of the source that I'm taking it from, that language just fits better. So I think it's very much something you can be flexible with, because ultimately you're not just a reproducer of something, you're an artist making that song your own, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's very it's the sort of thing where you think, okay, well, look, if it's just a case of adding in 3 more words into this line, or adding another line in, I'm not going to suddenly. You might want to just keep the language consistent enough just to bridge the gap. But it's difficult, I mean, it depends on the amount of work you put into it. A singer like Chris Wood, who, for me is probably, if I'm honest, is probably my favourite singer of traditional songs. Yeah. And I think, not that he does it a huge amount anymore, but, if you look at the traditional songs that he's chosen to include on the sort of solo albums he's made, have been very heavily reworked. To varying degrees, but essentially, so his version of Lord Bateman, which is, interestingly, I came very close to recording a version of Lord Bateman on this album, and just wasn't sure. It just felt like a weird thing to do, just because I know, Chris Wood's recording of that recording of that song on The Lark Descending is my single favourite, recording of anyone ever singing any, ever. I just think it's the best. I just think it's that rare thing that it is just perfect. Yeah. And so it was weird thinking like, well, I know, I'm sort of fairly sure that anything I do would always be so far below that. So you think, is there any point? And I did come up with a very different version melodically, and was sort of reworking that, and got to the end and did find some nice verses from Scott's versions that have got some really lovely imagery in them and stuff, but in the end, it didn't work out, and it's not on the album. But it may be in the future. But yeah, Chris is, from what I understand, Chris's reworking of that song took just years and years and years and years and years, and there is a consistency in the language. Yeah. It doesn't. There's an economy. In many ways, it's sort of the folk that folk process of kind of singing it and singing it and singing it until it fits.
Goes.
He did in the probably that's probably the best example of that I've ever come across.
Yeah.
He's someone who is much more selective about, I think, the songs he chooses to, certainly the traditional songs he chose to sing and he chose to put on those albums. I'm not a songwriter, so all my albums are filled up with trad songs, and it's I think it's a slightly different thing, but yeah, I mean, maybe I should be paying more attention to detail and should be trying to do as good a job as Chris has done with the ballads that he's sung, but what I don't want to be doing is sort of coming up with ersatz sort of old ballads that that are meant to that are essentially forgeries. You know what I mean? I came close to that on the first album with that a song called "The River Don't Run," which is written by two dear friends of mine, and it's sort of it's something I've always said I thought was a terrible thing, is writing songs about about the olden days, and actually but I was particularly struck by it, and
it's a great song, so
did it anyway. But the language in that is not the sentence structures, the syntax isn't archaic, and there isn't a huge amount of archaic language in there, actually, I think, which recommends it slightly better.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you listen to a lot of kind of what I guess would be termed world music, which kind of is a really stupid term in my opinion, but it's something that that obviously is kind of related, I think, because typically those kind of regional musics are a form of folk music in their place. But have you found that kind of listening to those things, has it influenced you, or has it informed any of your playing and your melody working with British folk songs? Or
I mean I'd say, first of all, I think actually what's interesting is I used to think, God, what a ridiculous thing, there's no such thing as world music, until I actually started studying traditional music from around the world. I was like, oh no, there is. It's basically you take the slightly more palatable end of a music tradition and get a Western music producer to produce it, and
that's world music.
Market it to like middle class ladies who wear purple, so I think actually there is such a genre as world music, but I mean it must be said that I tend to go for the pure stuff. I mean, this is the interesting thing. There are lots of most cultures will have most of these categories fulfilled. So there will be, most cultures have an art music and a succession, a selection of folk traditions, generally both instrumental and sung, which may or may not be interrelated. Most cultures will have some kind of religious music, often more than one. Sometimes there will be a sort of high church music and a popular religious music or whatever. Most countries will have a modern pop music. And a lot of countries will have a kind of traditional music which they've exported elsewhere, and actually those things are not every culture can tick all those boxes, but most cultures can tick most of them. So for me, traditional music is something. There are more, for me, what's been really useful is I mean I sort of essentially studied ethnomusicology as my degree.
Okay.
And what's really useful, I think, about that is that when I'm looking to compare English traditional music with other things, I'm able to look sideways at what other cultures are doing with their equivalent of that, rather than looking at how pop music or church music or classical music behave within our culture. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's not to say that it's the wrong way to do it. I think it is. Basically, I don't see the need for folk music to behave like pop music, and I think that's a lot of, I hear a lot of people saying, like, why can't folk music be like this? Why can't folk music be like, rock and roll or pop? And you say, well, because if you look at every other country in the world, their folk music is sort of ring fenced in the same way that ours is, in that there's pop music is much better at being pop music than folk music will ever be. Do you know what I mean? So and I think once you acknowledge that, then I think it's a lot easier to just be like, okay, great. So how do we? If you subscribe to the idea that folk music is something that exists in most cultures and has a place as within the wider palette of the cultural goings on of any people, then I think it's easier to allow it to exist on its own terms. Not to say that you don't innovate or there's not you can't explore it more deeply or in more different ways, or you can't interact with other art forms, but you're not saying like, oh no, we can't, you're not asking it to function in ways that it's not very well suited to, if that makes sense. So I think I think being able to look sideways is very useful for that stuff, and actually is I think we could probably do with a lot of that in general in this country. I think we seem to still seem to see ourselves as the default culture globally, and we're seeing that sort of British exceptionalism is about to really, we're going to realise very, very quickly that we are just another country.
That's right.
And politically and economically, we are, this exceptionalism that we've sort of been leading ourselves to believe is going to really smack us in the face.
And it's something that's never really existed, and that's what I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole, but it's something that I find so frustrating. Even the people who bang on about the Blitz and all of that forget that the reason we didn't starve during the war was that the Americans were sending shiploads of food weekly to supply us, and it was not, it wasn't just the bold British spirit that stuck one to the Germans. It was a huge group effort of multiple countries in the world coming together to defeat something which is now becoming a thing again. Anyway. I could get very mad about this. So.
It's terrifying and it's terrifying and so short-sighted in so many ways, and I mean all the rhetoric around that, the sort of of course there is lots of beautiful things about the Second World War and what people coming together, but also actually there was huge amounts of crime going on domestically. There was a thriving black market exploited by the same sort of people who will always do that. People's homes were getting looted after. Actually, there was huge amounts of discord societally, and let's face it, it was actually the fucking Russians who won the war in the end anyway. So the idea that we've plucky Brits on this little island, did it? What an absolute load of fucking nonsense.
I mean, the amount of death and sacrifice of people in like places like Ukraine and Poland and basically you could make a very strong argument that the Siberian winter pretty much killed the war in the end. But,
or even if you want to, even if you want to still involve the British in the victory, you have to admit it was. I mean, it was supposedly an exercise in European unity that actually ended up doing for it, not isolation. I mean, and again, it's like that brilliant Mitchell and Webb sketch where they're Nazis in the trenches and
we
like,
the
one goes,
baddies?
like, we the bad. It's sort of like you have to look.
Yeah.
And again, it's why I find. I mean, there is a culture of anti-intellectualism in Britain in general, and particularly amongst the English working class. I come from a confused class background, but both my parents have always done working class jobs. My mum, you'd probably still say, was a working class woman, and I sort of forget, because I live entirely amongst middle class people now, and I'm much more confirmedly middle class myself. I sort of forget how much there is that culture of anti-intellectualism amongst the English working classes, to the extent that I got beaten up in a pub last year for talking about politics, and someone overheard me, and I wasn't even particularly talking about party politics but you think actually there is this, we can see how all these arguments don't make sense and don't add up, but actually that's not what people want. It's like I live in Bristol, and seeing what happened with the pulling down of the Colson statue.
Yeah, it was amazing.
It's that sort of thing of all these horrible, like there's a big problem with bikers in Bristol. Bristol is a very left-wing kind of fluffy town in a lot of respects, but there is actually quite a lot of like nasty white nationalism amongst certain sects, and there was actually, quite near where I live, there's quite a lot of Hells Angels who are really nasty pieces of work and are basically Nazis. So all these blokes turned up outside the statue, the plinth of the statue, defending well after it had come down. No, it was the cenotaph, rather.
That's right, yeah.
Which is in the same bit of town. But this idea of sort of people, we can look at them and think, well, the idea of Nazis defending a war memorial to people who died fighting Nazis, that doesn't make sense to us. You think it's a load of nonsense, or people's reaction to that statue is interesting, in that people are going, well, it's history, it's there, you shouldn't tear it down, we shouldn't have to do that. And they're not left-wing voices who want people to be staring it in the face. Those are the voices of people who are, I think what they're really saying is, we don't really want to interrogate it. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to look about it. We don't actually, and it's not even that they're saying it's not even saying that we acknowledge that the British Empire did disgusting things and we don't want to have to look at it. They're actually saying, I'm much happier just imagining that the British Empire was a nice thing, and I don't really want you to challenge that idea.
And many people actively make the argument that it was better for the people that we bloody invaded and asset stripped. And it's just I mean it is extraordinary, and on the one hand you can do an intellectual exercise and you can understand a certain degree of resentment, because from going back a very, very long way, in my lifetime, actually, most of my lifetime, we've been under a Tory government, which has systematically dismantled the support system for the working classes. And yet, the working classes have consistently supported the Tories, and it's just something that beggars belief.
But I think there is something, if a project like the British Empire, you can only, you are requiring a lot of people to commit acts of like brutality, on a personal or corporeal level, as well as a political one. And actually, you have to think what are the necessary, what do you have to put in place in order to co-opt people into doing that? So you sort of think instilling this idea that we are superior and that there is a right way of doing things, and that we are, it is the white man's burden to go and civilise the rest of the world.
Civilised education and, high art and all of this stuff.
And if you need, white working class men to go and travel halfway around the world sweating their bollocks off in a red tunic in somewhere in the tropics. Like you got to make that really, you got to hammer that argument home. And if we've been told that for generation after generation after generation after generation, it's quite hard to get that out of the psyche of people. And actually, what was that quote? It's easier to fool someone than to convince them they've been fooled.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you right. It's easy for me to say as someone who, has got a degree and is allowed to mouth off on the internet about my opinions about stuff, and feels intellectually and culturally empowered to say this, but actually it's a really damaging thing to say, oh yeah, this country that you love, that flag that you like waving, that monarchy that you have on your teacup. Yeah, they all think you're fucking idiots. Yeah. It's a really horrible thing. It's not a nice thing to have to acknowledge, is it?
And the whole education system. I mean, I grew up in the north of England mostly, and so I lived in very working class areas most of my young life, and I just remember even at school, and I always went to state schools and comprehensives and stuff like that. We were taught things in a way that really just supported the status quo, that that the Brits had a great empire, that we learned about the amazing things that Henry VIII did, that broke them from the church and built this strong independent country, and then Victoria, what she did, and then Churchill being this amazing kind of leader, and then you kind of grow up and you start reading things and you think, oh fuck, this is actually like this is really not what happened, and you can see some of the things that were, some of the things they were right about, but other things they just absolutely were just doing things, as you say, even things like, for instance, like the very first healthcare systems, they were really just set up so that the soldiers could be kept in a healthy state to go off to, go back to fight and stuff like that. So, so anyway, I guess we could go a long way, but I think it's interesting. I think this is interesting, and Jim actually mentioned this as well, and I wonder what you think about it. Is that there was this whole thing of like the folk against fascism, or folk against racism, or something. Folk against fascism, I think it was called, and it was interesting because there are aspects of folk music that have kind of been co-opted, let's say, by the right wing, by the very kind of Britain is great brigade, let's say, things like the Morris dancing and St George's Day and all of those things, and sometimes I think there's a little bit of a tension between that and being a folk musician, because kind of in a way, I suppose, perpetuating those traditions and those songs and those things that might be considered in that way through a lens. So it's more like, I guess, finding a way to be more comfortable with Englishness, but in a more positive and a more diverse and a more forward-looking way than
I think that's it. I mean, I think it's it's there for everybody, and we can't those of us on the left can't say, no, this is ours. You can't have that. I mean, essentially, it's for me, what attracts me to it is the sort of the unknowable, and the diaphanous, and the things that are mysterious, and that we don't, someone got this song off someone else and they got that song off there, but then it will disappear into there's something beautifully unknowable and uncertain and fluid, and the fact that these songs exist actually in all over the English speaking world, and actually often have equivalents in other languages and things like that. And it's what's so lovely about it is that what the popular right deals with is is certainty. That's their stock in trade. Right. It's really nice, basic, strong narratives which you don't have to think about too much. And I sort of feel like it doesn't. For me, what I think of as folk music, what I think folk music is, and what I think folk music is good at, seems so entirely incompatible with that kind of, that little England view on the world. Yeah. But obviously they are. I mean, to be honest with you, this has been happening every now and again. It's happened again recently, and it happened again in quite a big way with the BNP about 10 years ago, which is when the Folk Against Fascism thing started. I mean, they've tried to do it, but the reality is, I actually, they've said that they like this, or that this is an example of something which is I don't think they actually do. I think it's something that they've decided looks like it might be good or they should. But I don't think. I mean, I've not noticed any difference in the demographic at gigs and things like that. You don't get.
It's kind of a talking point. Up at
but no, I mean but it is an interesting thing, I had it when I was doing my degree. People would, these very nice middle class North London kids, in their colourful shirts would say, "Oh yeah, so what do you play?" And I say, "Well, I play English music." And I think they looked at me with some suspicion, as if, and they were obviously 18 years old, so we will forgive them. But like as if like, "Oh, what, you didn't want to learn to play the chorus?" Well, obviously my point of view would be, well, actually, people from the Monday cultural world are like doing a very good job of playing the chorus.
That's right.
Probably don't need my help.
Exactly,
I mean, if only the term cultural appropriation had some currency back then, I might have been able to. But essentially, for me, what I left that degree, that university after 3 years with a sense that more than anything, I want to be able to meet, as I do get to occasionally meet, and I did so more then, meet traditional musicians from other part of the world. I want to be able to meet them from a place of absolute cultural equality, which is to say, I think what you do is wonderful, and I have this, I have this very odd thing, rather than whilst their attitude was essentially well-meaning, it started to sound a lot to me like, we are the default culture, and isn't it wonderful what these people are getting up to over there? It's
almost like, we've discovered this music.
But I mean that's it. There's something interesting about, I think there's an interesting. A lot of Irish musicians I know, make a significant portion of their income in touring Germany.
Yeah.
And a lot of their money touring here as well. I think it's probably fair to say there are more English people playing Irish music than there are English people playing English music. And I think there's something very interesting about that, in that, Germany's relationship with its traditional music is very much coloured by the kind of inclusion in the cultural arm of National Socialism in the 30s and 40s. So, that what is it, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, that coming to terms with one's past thing, that and I think has probably discouraged a lot of German people feel uncomfortable about engaging with their traditional music. But it's interesting that, I don't know this for sure, but I think it feels to me like if you take two countries like England and Germany, one thing they have in common is that they've spent a lot of time telling other people what to do. You know what I mean? Like, this obviously Germany doesn't do it quite so successfully, but in terms of the idea of being, we're a country who can, this one-time perceived sense of superiority. And I think it's interesting that, lots of people, I feel like there are lots of people who love English people who love Irish music, but maybe wouldn't be so interested in, Joyce or Beckett in that. Whereas, I think the way that English people see themselves is as a country that has always done a very good job of doing high culture. You know what I mean? And I think probably Germany sees itself like that as well, to a certain extent. And the idea of, the idea of things that are culturally peculiar, things that we would call the folk arts, are the sort of things that I think English people don't assume that we don't do.
Right.
You know what I mean? Whereas it's exactly the sort of thing we assume Irish people do.
Yeah,
to do,
that's right. Yeah.
We assume that Ireland only produces, culture that exists in this place.
Yeah,
it's
all folks and folky fiddles and Celtic music.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and obviously Irish traditional music is fantastic, and is in ruder health than any other in Europe. But I think, the amount of times, you meet English people and refuse to believe that the tune you're playing is English because surely that's Irish or Scottish maybe at least.
Right.
And it's sort of, I feel like that there is, it's not the sort of thing that we assume that we do here, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I think there's, and I think, I mean, there's, if you look at Wales, I think there's lots of interesting comparisons there. The Welsh, it seems to me most of the kind of the sort of nationalist energy culturally has gone into much more polite and kind of formal kinds of music. So, like male voice squares,
hymns and
and even if you look at the way that Welsh, even if the way you look at sort of Welsh language songs, which we would often be, there's obviously a lot of Welsh language hymns, but Welsh language, what we would think of as folk songs, the way they're presented, like at the Eisteddfod and things like that, it's quite polite and formalised. And I think there's something interesting about. I think you can actually probably infer a fair amount about, I don't know whether that's the influence of sort of non-conformist Christianity, the chapel rather than church thing. I don't know, but it's it's interesting looking at the way
the cultural
people
kind of
deal with their the way countries deal with it or don't do it or ignore it or celebrate some things. I think it tells you a lot about what a people think of themselves.
Yeah,
if you know what I mean. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, it did. I think that's probably a great place to tie it up. Probably. But it's been fascinating to talk to you, and thank you so much for spending time with me and chatting. It's been really, really interesting, and I really look forward to hearing your new album when it comes out. Yes, so that should be out in a month or so. Perfect. In the meantime, there's two others people can buy. Yes. If you want to go to nickhartmusic.com, it's all up there, and loads of other bits of stuff. Highly recommended. Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Cheers. There was a ship to old England came, launched from the stocks bound for the main. Her sides were oak and her keel was box. She's a gallant ship launched from the stocks. Launched from the stocks bound for the main. 50 big guns on her deck lay plain. Besides 500 brisk young men, all picked and chosen, every one. We weighed our anchors to the bow, through the wide oceans we did plough. As we were ploughing through the deep, 5 French men of war we did meet. When we did meet, night drawing on, our lives grew sweet.
We waited there till the break of day, and then began the bloody fray. It's then spoke our chief mate bold unto the little cabin boy. Go up the mast, see what you spy, come down again immediately. I spy 3 ships coming from the west. They do advance, they make great haste. Their names to you I'll now let know. There was one the Oak, the other the Slow, and the third was called the Unity. And they've quickly made those French dogs flee. Grain gods had a hand in this. Our little boy old danger missed. Our little boy on the topmast high, where powder and shot so thick did fly.